to begin with, I'd like to know more about you as a mediator and the work that you've been doing as a mediator.
I've been working with the Restorative Justice Centre for over 20 years. I was one of the founders of the centre. And the vision for that grew out of working in the criminal court context as a probation officer, and engaging with some of those realities there around pre-sentence reports, and the issues between victims and offenders, and that there was a deep skepticism about the way that the courts were dealing with what was often matters of personal conflict. And so I got exposed to the idea of restorative justice, initially, particularly the New Zealand model of family group conferencing, and then more widely than that. So my experience has been, I guess, as an initiator and as the leader in the organization, initiating, enabling, training, and not so much in the direct mediation itself. So within the RJC, that is still our focus, in mediating cases that are within the criminal justice context. So with referrals from the courts as an alternative to a trial, but also with matters coming out of the prisons, with people that are being released from prison, becoming eligible for parole, and needing to engage with their victims and their families before they are released. So that's the main context and thrust of our work. But we are looking beyond that and have done a little bit outside of the criminal justice context. So a little bit within schools, and here and there within organizations, so basically workplace conflict, and also interested very much in framing restorative justice mediation as part of peace building more generally. And so in that sense, then looking at local community conflict. So not really at the macro level of societal conflict or societies in transition, but local community conflict, whatever form that would take. But we haven't really done much direct work in that space. So I think that's the sort of background. So I do not regard myself, as a highly experienced mediator, because even though I've been in the space for many years, as I said, it's been more of an initiator and an enabler and also a trainer to equip people to operate in that space than doing all that work myself. Obviously, I have done some cases as well, but that hasn't been, it hasn't been my main focus. My main focus, I suppose, has been running the organization and equipping others to do that work.
Yeah, although you say you're not an experienced mediator, it's the number of conflicts that you have been part of in terms of trying to resolve have been quite numerous. And I just want to understand more about the work that you do in restorative justice. And I know in our context and with scholarship that is coming up, there's also a lot of conflating with restorative justice and African or ways of resolving mediation. So in your experience, would you say that there has been space for you as a mediator in this context, or broadly in the African context, to come up with your own values and to sort of show these values whenever you're mediating?
Yes, I think so. I think in terms of the court expectations or requirements, or the criminal justice system, let's say we're talking about the courts and the correctional environment, very don't have tight requirements at all. So the way that one does mediation is really up to you. So I think I've been influenced particularly by the the Mennonites, who've done a lot of pioneering work in restorative justice. So that's got a certain, I suppose, theological dimension to it, certainly a spiritual one. But I suppose if one were to frame that outside of that narrative, outside of that framework, it would be around the values of the belief in the value of dialogue, the belief that and the belief in the value of peace, and in continuing to strive for peace and for resolving interpersonal conflict, how that impacts on crime and future crime and repeat crime. And then with that, I suppose, and it would be also with the within that Mennonite, what's the word I'm looking for? Within that sort of broader family, John Paul Lederach's approach to conflict transformation, that has come into that space as well. I suppose another influence that I am aware of, if I'm thinking of it from that in that way, would be from a moral development perspective, and how does the particular thing that I'm thinking of now is the fact that if people are in conflict with one another, and particularly if a crime has been committed, so I mean, a good example would be any assault, so any interpersonal violence. So assault, serious assault, and then with that, domestic violence, if you add that context to it. I think there is a moral dimension in the sense that there's a right and a wrong. Somebody is in the right, somebody is wrong. It's not always as clear as that. Maybe both people, their behavior has breached certain moral norms and values. But the idea of talking about those values and those norms and how they've been breached and why are they important, that is an exercise in moral development. If one's looking at the literature of moral development and what constitutes growing morally. So one of the questions I had when I was doing my master's was, can an adult grow morally? If we accept that a crime is a moral failure of some kind, and we often put a lot of attention onto personal development and things like substance abuse, and the values that somebody's grown up with and personal development, but what about the moral dimensions? And that was the answer that I came up with then, is that engaging on an issue like this is an act of moral development. So I have, and there's a whole body of literature, not a whole body, there is some literature around that, which I've tried to integrate into RJC's practice, in terms of more explicitly encouraging people to reflect on what the values at stake are and why those are important. More recently, a colleague has brought in what is called engaging worldviews. So actively trying to understand the prevailing worldview of the particular stakeholders and the parties specifically, and asking them to reflect on their behavior in the light of their worldview and those values, and whether their behavior has violated that worldview and those values, and if so, what that then means and what an appropriate response is. So I suppose that's a very long answer to your question, but I suppose it's those are ways in which some of the values that I suppose that I've become aware of that are important to me have started playing out and influenced my practice and the community of practice of the RJC.
And very interesting in terms of how, these things shape up why once you're in a particular situation that you need to mediate, and how everything starts linking up. So would you say what is more important to you? Is it the process itself, bringing in those values, or is it the outcome of the entire mediation itself in terms of resolving conflict?
So you probably are familiar with that continuum that puts outcome and settlement driven mediation on the one side, and narrative, facilitative, and transformative mediation on the other side. So I think that restorative justice mediation is by definition on the facilitative and transformative side. But what was your specific question again?
Well, I was just wondering, what is more important to you? Is it the entire process, or is the outcome?
The outcome.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was just forgetting that specific bit. So definitely the process, not the outcome is not unimportant, but the process is certainly equally.
And saying that the process is more important, what would you say is a successful mediation? What would you say would be the outcome in a successful process of mediation?
We don't have fixed criteria for that. I think in the restorative justice literature, there have been things like repeat offending as one of the criteria, for more long term, but then also feelings of anger and feelings of revenge on both the part of the victim and the offender, and to what extent those are reduced or changed before and after a mediation. So I think that a successful mediation is one in which an agreement is reached. If an agreement is not reached, that still doesn't mean that it wasn't successful, because the fact that they've engaged could have led to other insights, which could we could measure the significance of the process in terms of that agreement. What were the original things that led to the crime or the conflict, and have those been addressed in the agreement that is reached? So I think that the some sort of resolution of the original conflict, and that if there's been a crime, which in our case there has been, an agreement to make things right, whatever that means for the parties, but the fact that they reach an agreement to make things right, I think that would constitute a successful mediation.
And having specified those values and what restorative justice would look like, what do you think is the criteria for the selection of a lead mediator? Or do you think there should be a criteria for the selection of a lead mediator?
So in most of the cases that we deal with, we only have single mediators. We've started now moving, in the case of correctional services matters, we've started now moving in the direction of co-mediators, but that's for a different reason. And I suppose, just to make sense, I need to just outline. It's my understanding is that it's not possible to accredit mediators in terms of any SACWA unit standards. There's no statutory body to accredit mediators. And what family mediators and commercial mediators have done is to set up their own internationally benchmarked framework, which is essentially a peer mediation, a peer accreditation system. So it's not run by government. So it's run by peers, but with an objective frame of reference and criteria. So we've done some work with a couple of other colleagues from the family mediation space to develop a system of accreditation for restorative justice mediation. And we've then benchmarked off some international practice and used the categories of the Restorative Justice Council in the UK. And those categories are a foundational mediator, an intermediate mediator or intermediate practitioner, and then an advanced practitioner. And I think there's a trainer is beyond that. So the way we pivoted that slightly then for our context here is that foundational practitioners would be people who are either volunteers or people who are not professional mediators. In other words, they've got another job, but they're interested in mediation or restorative justice practice. And those are the people that we are using in the BCS context to make contact with victims and to set up the meetings. And we've been doing that for the last 3 or 4 years like that. To quite good effect. But for the sake of good practice and protection of the parties and the mediators themselves, we decided that the foundational practitioners should not mediate things by themselves. They should only do that as co-facilitators with an intermediate or an advanced practitioner. So for that reason, we are moving in that direction, that the foundational practitioners would set up the meetings and then work as a co-facilitator with the other practitioner. So that person, I suppose, then would be the lead mediator. And the criteria for that lead mediator would be as we've set up in that framework. And I can send you that. It's a whole big thing in terms of the training that goes towards that. But the basic criteria for how do you then get that label of a foundational practitioner or an intermediate or advanced practitioner is fairly straightforward.
All right, and just to follow up on that, with the issue of co-mediators, do you find that there are sometimes clashes in terms of personalities and mediation styles with the mediators themselves?
So we haven't really done any of that before, but mostly it's been single people. And we haven't had any difficulties with that. We even had to work out a sort of framework. So I think we've always been clear that one person is the lead mediator and the other one is supportive. But we haven't had conflict between them or anything like that we've had to deal with.
Well, thank you for that. That's very interesting. And just to move on to my next question, in terms of the mediation environment itself, we find that there is a lot of patriarchy. And do you find that women are able to mediate in the conflicts that you find yourselves as an organization attending to? Or do you find that women find it difficult role as mediators?
So our context largely, as I said just now, criminal justice and then urban, because that's where we are in Pretoria. And most of our mediators in the 20 plus years that we've been operating have been women. There have been a few men, but they've by far been in the minority.
Well, that's very interesting because it's often the opposite in those contexts. And would you say would you say it's because there are more women in the network, or how have you been able to sort of sustain having more women as mediators, or do you find that they sort of are more willing to take on this role as mediators?
Look, I think essentially we've worked with, and I think so. I mean, we grew out of, no, that's not the right way of putting it. I suppose our starting point was very much a social service NGO. And so we started using only social workers as mediators. So we no longer do that. We think that other people can be equally competent mediators, but in the social service agency space, it does tend to be female dominated. And that's probably, yeah, that would be a separate research dimension as to one of those would be financial. There's not a lot of money in the social service environment. And so men, I think, tend to be more mobile and move on to other jobs where there's better remuneration. So there are men in the social service space, but it's probably something like 20-30% as opposed to women.
That's interesting, which brings me to my next question. You spoke about the issues of funding, and I just wanted to find out, typically, what are some of the challenges that you face in your work as mediators, and how you overcome them?
So funding is the biggest one. So we've been going since the end of 2000, beginning of 2001. And until August 2012, we had some funding from Social Development, Gauteng Department of Social Development. At that point, for a number of reasons, things went a bit sour in our relationship with them. And despite us trying, they've never funded us since. So the funding we've had since then has been very ad hoc and not ongoing. So there's often gaps between grants. The most consistent funder has been the National Lottery, and often funding like 20-30% of the budget that we apply for. So that's meant, for the last 10-12 years that things have been very, very constrained to be able to do that work. The last couple of years, there's also been, in the gender-based violence space, some other funders that have stepped forward, which we've been able to access, but it's still been very, not large grants at all. And so we've been forced to use only contract staff, whereas before we had full-time staff and full-time mediators dealing with cases that come from the courts all the time. Now that we only work on a contract staff basis and then pay people for the work that they're doing. So funding has been the most massive obstacle. I suppose the other big one would be the disconnect. No, let me frame that differently. To quite a large extent on the ground, and so when I say on the and local officials at correctional services can see the value of mediation, and so they're happy to refer. But there's very little leadership higher up in those systems. In DCS, there is some, and there is actually a dedicated policy to managing that. But again, that aspect of their work of tracing victims, contacting victims, managing these processes there's not a lot of resources allocated to that. I can't state this for a fact, but at one point I know that they were only allocating one social auxiliary worker per what they call service area. So basically one prison, which could have 5,000 inmates with people being released every single month. And there'd be one social auxiliary worker to contact all of those parties. So essentially, we're providing support to that function at the moment, without any financial support from them. As that, okay. So it's happening, and it's reported on in their annual report. But I don't see much leadership, and in fact, things at times have got quite messy with various people in the department sort of pulling it in different directions. And within the court area or the court arena, as part of a trial process, whether that's pre-trial or part of sentencing, there's been zero leadership from the Department of Justice or from the NPA, and that's been very problematic. At one stage, there was a national policy framework that was being developed, and I played a very active part in that. And at some point it was about to be signed off, and then seems to have got moved to another unit and has since been forgotten, it seems. And that was 7 or so years ago already. So I think those have been the biggest obstacles, the funding and the lack of leadership within government departments. And so it's really failed to meet the potential that it has. And so nobody said, this is a bad idea, it can't work for these and these reasons. It just hasn't been actually implemented and resourced properly.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. And I just wanted also to ask you personally, as a mediator, have you found some situations in terms of mediating particularly challenging, or maybe you've had a standoff with, people who you're supposed to be mediating with? In terms of your own personal experience as well, would you say that you've had particularly challenging situation as a mediator, and how you dealt with it as well?
The case that I dealt with recently, let me just see how best I can give you a bit of context. There's we generally use the phrase in the UN Handbook on Restorative Justice. They talk about a restorative justice process, which would be an umbrella term to include things like victim offender mediation, victim offender dialogue, family group conferencing, victim offender conferencing, as well as a restorative conversation. So there are differences of emphasis with all of those, but the UN Handbook has put them all under that umbrella of a restorative justice process, meaning parties come together with the help of a facilitator, and there could be a varying number of parties involved, not necessarily just the initial perpetrator and victim. So restorative conversation would be one in which there isn't a crime, but some relationship that has gone wrong. One party has harmed another in some way. So recently, I had a request from a woman who'd been involved with somebody romantically. She was in another country, or another continent actually, and the guy was here. There were some fairly specific, unique details to that matter that made it quite unique. In that he was studying to be a pastor, and he'd had this on-off relationship with her, and then, I suppose, acting authentically in the relationship. So one of the outcomes that she was looking for was that before he was then allowed to go into a particular denomination that he was part of, that there should be full disclosure to his superiors about the relationship. So to get to your question of what's been particularly challenging, sure, I thought that this would be reasonably straightforward. So our usual approach is at least one individual meeting, maybe some follow-up from that, and then if it's appropriate, to bring the parties together. So sort of those 3 meetings. This became more complicated with lots of to and fro in between the meetings. We ended up having 2 meetings because the first one went over the time we'd set aside, and then several follow-ups after that as well. And just the intensity of emotion and the nuances of what each party was looking for, what they meant, how they felt I was understanding it and not understanding it, became very, very important. So it became incredibly nuanced. So that was particularly challenging in a way that I hadn't found other mediations to be.
Thank you for sharing that, Mike. And yeah, I'm sure it was a particularly interesting and difficult case to deal with. And any learnings that you could take from those particular difficult mediations that you would take into a next mediation, for example. Would you find that each mediation has particular lessons that you could use for the next?
So I don't think there's specific lessons that really stand out. I think that I did some training with through the Rotary International initiative with Mediators Beyond Borders last year. You know Sokva? Yeah. So I think he's the representative or coordinator, one of them for that process in South Africa at the moment. So I participated in that training because I was trained. And I think that what I learned was that even though the context was different, so community mediation is not the same as, let's say, two people involved in an intimate relationship. The context is, community context, it's more complex because there's multiple stakeholders that they need to engage with and understand. And the importance of deep listening. And after you've been doing that for some years, you think, yeah, I can listen. But listening, there's listening and there's listening. So I think I was challenged afresh out of that process. And then maybe this one that I've just told you about the importance of listening beyond the obvious. So the different levels, the deeper levels of listening to the things that are not being said, and the significance of that, and the things that are being said as well, obviously. And so one can never, I don't think you can ever stop learning to listen and learning to facilitate a process, because it's always very dynamic, always very, very complex. And so one has to stay very humble in terms of how one does that. And in that sense, I don't think there are any experts. You can learn some skills and become reasonably competent, but that's no guarantee that you're going to do it well in the next situation. You could easily mess it up or miss some things. So perhaps that's the lesson that I've learned and have been crystallizing over the last hour.
Indeed, you never stop learning. That's very true. And I'd just like to thank you so much for your time, Mike, and for sharing these important insights. It was great speaking with you.